What's up, everyone? Online prep coach Alex here with theprepcoach.com, and we're starting a new series on this group called the Basics, probably basic biology, something like that. Because as I've been doing more and more podcasts, as I'm talking to more and more people, traveling around, doing more and more education, I'm realizing it's still the basics, or a lot of people are missing. So everyone's doing research now on the end goal, right? They're researching BPC 157, they're researching whatever, creatine, they're researching whatever the end result, goal, supplement, or peptide is without understanding the basics of what's going on internally. And although we've talked about that a lot, and I've talked about a lot of the basics, I want to get super basic and really make sure people understand so that you can understand your pharmacology, your supplementation, your peptides, while you're training, while you're eating. I really want to take this to a next level. Today, I think the best place to start off is with female fertility, mainly ovulation, because you can understand how to use medications more intelligently, peptides more intelligently if you're a female, if you understand the basics of ovulation. And although I think a lot of women understand their menstrual cycle to a degree, I don't think they understand it to the degree we're about to go in today. And then most guys don't quite understand this at all. And so I think it's kind of a good refresher course in the basics of biology, and it'll really help you understand how to apply this stuff more intelligently. So the basics of ovulation, we're gonna be starting off. Again, love the big board because we got more than enough space to go over this. We're starting off with the basics in the actual hypothalamus. So in the hypothalamus, we're gonna have two main things we're looking at here, two different nuclei. We're looking at what is called the paraventricular, actually no, we're gonna get to that later on. We're gonna look at the arcuate nucleus and the preoptic nucleus. So we're looking at the actual arcuate nucleus and the preoptic nucleus. Now, these nuclei will go ahead and they'll release what? We all know this one. This one is gonadotropin releasing hormone. You've heard that because you've heard about things like FSH and LH and things we're about to get to here in HCG and HMG and Clomid. That's all understanding and starting here with these basics. So in females, we have the hypothalamus, arcuate nucleus, preoptic nucleus, releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is going to go downstream, and that is going to interact with what? The anterior pituitary, specifically the gonadotropes in that area, to pump out our good old luteinizing hormone and our follicle stimulating hormone. Now, although it's not as simple as that, we have to look at two different cells that these are interacting with. We're looking mainly at what are called fecal cells, and then we're looking at granulosa cells. So the cool thing is LH is mainly going to, interaction in the fecal cell, is mainly going to be modulating cholesterol, right? That is going to drive androgen synthesis, which is going to then actually push down, I'm going to say E2 for estradiol, but in reality, we're talking about all estrogens, whereas FSH in the granulosa cells is going to be more estrogen dependent. So we can kind of block these off and think about fecal cell interaction with luteinizing hormone in granulosa cells with FSH and estrogen. Again, estrogens as a whole. Now, with the basic understanding of the basic neurochemistry, the basic hormonal interaction that eventually gives us our hormones as a female, let's look at how these things are actually developing in the ovaries with our eggs and all that kind of cool stuff. We have to go way, way back to birth, right? At birth, we're born with a certain amount of these diploid stem cells. So we have these actual diploid stem cells. We're starting off here. So we have our diploid stem cells. Now, diploid obviously two, so you have two different pairs of chromosomes. We are going to go through this whole process. Eventually you'll mature and you'll have puberty, and you're going to actually have what are called primordial follicles. Now, these primordial follicles are going to go through, once we go ahead and we hit puberty, which I'll put in red there. We're going to go ahead and hit puberty. That is going to go ahead and give us a primary follicle. Now, from that primary follicle, we have a whole maturation phase that we'll kind of illustrate here in a second that'll go into an early secondary follicle to a late secondary follicle and all the way to what we care about the most, a Graafian follicle. Now, if you kind of go back through this whole process where androgens interact, understand that at each of these cascades, there's going to be the interplay of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone to some degree. We'll talk about the specifics in a second. But as we see this maturation kind of occurring, right, what we see here is we start to see that initial, we're going to say one cell, and we're going to say around it is one layer, right? One layer of cells. Then as we kind of mature this follicle, we are going to see that cell, but now being surrounded by all of these other layers of cells. And they should look more bubbly, like little circles, but it wouldn't look good if I did on the board. Then eventually we get to a Graafian follicle. Now, Graafian follicle is then going to be pretty massive, right? There's going to be all these cells in it. There's going to be a huge hyaluronic acid, fluid-filled sac. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on. The whole point of days 1 through 14 is to get your primordial follicle all the way to a Graafian follicle. So if we write that out, right? Days 1 through 14, mainly the goal is to get that primordial follicle all the way to a Graafian follicle. What does that mean? That means this is primarily an FSH-dependent mechanism in cascade. What we see is roughly, again, depends on the female, but roughly days 7 through 9, we see that increase in estradiol, right? What ends up happening is as we increase estradiol, that's obviously going to go back over there. It's going to interact with the anterior pituitary. And in the actual pituitary, it's going to cause a negative feedback loop, which is then going to shut down that process and lower FSH. It's going to lower LH, and it is going to lower estrogen. Again, we're saying E2, but we're talking about all estrogens here. And then you kind of have that day 14, right, where you actually see another increase in estradiol because that feedback loop then stops. Now, at the same time that we have other things going on here to make that transition to get us an LH surge, to progesterone to drive ovulation. So what we have here is, if we can imagine this Graafian follicle, I'll go red for here, right? So we have this Graafian follicle. It's also, maybe that looks a little better. It's also going to release what's called inhibin, okay? So if it releases inhibin, that is going to go ahead and do what? It's going to shut down the anterior pituitary, essentially, and mainly shut down FSH. If it shuts down FSH, what has to happen? That LH surge kicks up. So now we see a massive luteinizing hormone surge. Now, this process will bifurcate into a couple things. Number one, it's going to go ahead and massively drive up progesterone. And also, it's going to go ahead and increase what we call as hemodynamics to the lower portion of the Graafian follicle. So that LH surge is then going to go ahead and start kind of pushing blood all the way down here, and it's going to start popping out all those little eggs. So, well, before that, actually, you have a release in proteases. Those proteases will then go ahead, pop out those eggs. So this is where ovulation actually occurs. I'm going to say eggs pop because they're popping out. They get stored in our good old fallopian tubes. And then we essentially have that whole transition of days essentially 15 or 14 through 28, where we have that transition into that next phase. Now, The reason why I said, again, it's so important to understand this from the basics is because if you're a female out there, right, you've heard about a lot of these hormones, you've heard about a lot of these different things. Like you probably heard about the hypothalamus, you've probably heard about the anterior pituitary, you've heard for sure about luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. You might not know what cells they're interacting in, and you probably didn't quite know the whole diploid stem cell, but like that's cool, that's okay. But what's important here is to see, okay, where estrogen is kind of peaking and falling, where estradiol, or rather progesterone, is peaking and falling, and what's happening in normal physiology. We need to know that, not just for fertility purposes and ovulation purposes, but even more so than that, for hormone replacement purposes. So these days, again, it's not 100%. Every female is different. Certain females will have different cycle lengths, but what's most important for you as a female is consistency in your cycle. If your luteal phase always lasts 10 days or 7 days or 14 days, it only matters based on you. That's number one. Number two, although we are only having the fallopian tube, egg popping, protease interaction here happening at that ovulation cycle phase, day 14, whatever we want to call that right there, it also, because sperm can live in the vaginal canal for basically 7 days or so. So you basically have the week before ovulation, the week of ovulation, and the week after ovulation, where you as a female can potentially get pregnant. That's why everyone doesn't have the same birthday. Because if every female basically had the same menstrual cycle, then guess what? Everyone have roughly the same birthdays. We wouldn't have people born on the 4th or the 5th. They'd be born on the 14th or whatever the arbitrary math is there. So because of that, we now look at this process and go, okay, two big things. We really know about when we have the potential to become pregnant and how to get pregnant. The potential to get pregnant and timing is, like I just said, kind of throughout the entire month. So you have basically 3 weeks out of the month where you have the potential to get pregnant, which is really cool, right? Now, going back to the HRT, I think this is I think the most important part to understand, the HRT and the fertility. So we're going to break this up into HRT basics for females and then fertility. And again, this is why understanding the basics is so important. Because if you can understand this whole cascade, all you have to do is then layer it into your life and your response. It tells you exactly what to do, which is super cool. So if you follow this whole cascade, look at the fecal-cell interaction, the cholesterol, the androgen metabolism, you start seeing the need for your baseline of testosterone. So whenever you equate roughly a female is releasing about 1 milligram of testosterone per week. Endogenously, naturally, most males are releasing about 10 milligrams. Now that's a massive range. That doesn't account for so many things, but that's why we have roughly, I always say like 4 to 6, we're gonna say 7 milligrams a week of injectable testosterone. That will be different if it's a gel transdermal, that'll be different. If it's an oral, that'll be different. It's a pellet. So many different changes, but roughly we're getting 1 milligram per day release of hormones, so roughly 7 milligrams a week. That's why most females are really good in that 4 to 10-ish milligram range, right? Now we go to our estradiol. Now, if you look at this entire phase, if you look at this entire process of ovulation, estrogen is involved in every single portion of it. Yes, it'll go up, yes, it'll come down, but it's always almost a background player at every single point in the cycle. So that tells us, independent of dosing, which will be based on the individual, this is going to be a daily player. And again, if it is an intravaginal applicator with like 0.2 milligrams, that could be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That could be every single day. You could do it a bunch of different ways, but we know estradiol should be in there almost every single day, depending on the female and their total numbers. Now we have progesterone, okay? And now progesterone. What do we see? LH surge. And so why do doctors typically prescribe progesterone 100 milligrams before bed, days 14 through 28? Because that's whenever it's actually occurring. Only on days 14 through 28 where you get a massive bump up in progesterone, and then the other days of the month, it's kind of average, doing its own endogenous action. Now, although this is the basic way to look at fertility, this is what's done in the medical community. This is why they have those numbers. This is why it is that way. Now, the problem with saying this is that this will work for 50% of females. Understanding the basic biology means 50% of you have been watching this, or if you're a male and you're helping out your wife, your girlfriend, whoever, or clients, whatever, 50% of females are going to respond well to this type of approach. That being said, what about the other 50%? Certain women will have to take up testosterone to crazy high levels. Most women will respond best to testosterones about in the nanograms. So if we're looking at actual blood values, we're looking at about 40 to 100. That tends to be a pretty good range on blood work. Now, certain women will respond very well in the 200 to 300 range, but there's generally a potential for masculization there. I know a lot of female HRT doctors right now are pushing hard to get these females to 200 plus on labs. And I'm not a big fan of that because most females do not respond well there. You should get a lot of hair loss and clitoral growth and things like that. So normally on labs, we're aiming for about 40 to 100, something in there. Base it off of yourself though. That's gonna change your dose. This could be anywhere from 3 milligrams total per week to 20 milligrams total per week. It's gonna massively change. So we have that variability. Estradiol. Certain women produce enough estradiol by themselves and through their testosterone that they do not need exogenous estradiol. If that's the case, the whole worry about taking progesterone without estradiol isn't a problem because all you care about is having enough estrogen. If you have enough estrogen, then actual thickening of the cervical area and the entire ovum-based area will not happen if progesterone's in play. So all you care about is estradiol is normal for you. Now, we almost can't give ranges on there because it's so unique to the individual. So I normally like biofeedback here. We're looking for things like vaginal lubrication. So you normally, if you have that vaginal creaminess that occurs, where it's very thick and viscous and not as fluidy, that's usually an overabundance of estradiol. So you can use that along with your libido to say, okay, where's my estradiol? Where's my testosterone? Then I can proceed. Progesterone's another one where certain women, 100, 200 milligrams, only days 14 through 28 work perfectly. Other women need it every single day. And so that's why there's this other 50% of women where they can have different combinations of everything. But understanding the basic biology and landscape now tells you, oh, that's why Dr. XYZ said to do it this way. But understand there's 50% variability. Now, using the basics, we can understand how to implement fertility compounds. So the basic ones, right? If we look at, we'll go with HMG, we'll go with Clomid, and we'll go with, we'll stick there. These ones are mainly going to be the players to drive up both FSH and LH, right? Whereas HCG is going to be the player that's mainly going to be LH dominant. Things like kisspeptin in females is going to be more of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Then we have other players like recombinant AMH. Oh, that looks a terrible M. Recombinant AMH, which improves the reserve quality of your eggs. So AMH, which is going to improve egg, I'm just going to say quality, but essentially it's those reserves. Now, again, if we kind of look at basic biology, we can track this all back, right, to the egg quality factor primarily being in the primordial and primary phases. We see the kisspeptin with gonadotropin releasing hormone coming over here and interacting before the anterior pituitary, more at the hypothalamus. Then we could see HCG coming in, and instead of going over here, actually it's gonna, we're looking at HCG coming over here. We're seeing the LH surge, and then we're seeing FSH and LH happening everywhere, right? Because you always have that balance of FSH and LH. So now, using basic biology, you can understand when to use which. Now, Clomid on paper says 25% chance to have twins. I have used Clomid with all 4 of my children to try and have twins. 0 twins. I have tried Clomid on not thousands, hundreds of couples at this point, 0 twins. So that part of the research is not even something I would even put any stock into. I wish it was, because we tried for it, didn't happen. And then multiple other people tried for it, didn't happen. So heads up on that. But the ability to drive up FSH and LH from a Clomid and HMG scenario is a massive benefit. Now, the problem is usually clinically. Clinically, they'll try and prescribe, like they'll say Clomid. They'll only do it at the peak of ovulation. So they'll do it around days 14, or they'll do it after the first bleed. Like they'll time it on specific periods. But what do we learn? FSH and LH are dominant throughout this entire ovulation phase. So you can induce ovulation by triggering both FSH and LH. So technically, pharmacologically, you can induce a state of prolonged ovulation by taking Clomid or HMG daily, or a week on, a week off. There's a tons of ways to dose it, but there's never a lot of success. And this is why clinical fertility is so low, because they'll tell you to take these compounds one time or for 2 doses and that's it. That's not how biology works, as you can tell up here. So then you have the HCG LH surge. You could still get away, because remember, if LH is surging, there's a potential to cross-stimulate progesterone with estradiol and estrogens as a whole. So there's still going to be some spin-off from an LH to an FSH. They have a very dynamic duo-based relationship because progesterone and estrogen do the same thing. And then you have kisspeptin to drive the entire process as a whole. And recombinant AMH is a lot less common. That's dosed at like a couple, like 5 micrograms, something like that. It's not commonly available, but it is something I want to put on the board so you can kind of understand the wide berth of options out there. I hope you guys enjoyed this first introduction to the basic biology series. This was covering ovulation, and now as a female or as a male working with females or your better half, you can now know and understand why HRT is done how it is. Remember variability, and then also look at fertility and see how it's dosed, why it's done like that in clinical practice, why it might not be the best way, and other ways to actually do that. So, as always, thank you so much for watching. Check out prepcoach.com. See you next time.